So hello everybody and welcome to the Atlanta.net Users Group, COVID edition. I am your host, Ken Ross, and by day working for Microsoft, where we're still hiring quite a few people here in the Atlanta area and really around the country. So if you're curious about that, be sure to hit me up and I'll see what I can do to point you in the right direction. I think where is Jim Woolley? Did you disappear? I think you had something that you wanted to mention as well.
He was here. Oh, there he is.
I'm here. Yeah, I've got a big bright spot on me right now with the sun. But Jim Williams with Solemn. We're a national consulting firm. We have openings right now in Atlanta for particularly .NET people. So if you're interested in doing some consulting as a consultant full-time, or even looking at possibly some temp consultants coming in to help out in specific projects, let me know. I'll put my contact information in the chat here for anybody who's interested.
I don't know if there's anybody else out there that has some openings that they wanted to share with the group. Feel free to speak up. Going once, going twice. All right, well then, without any further ado, our speaker tonight is Shawn Wildermuth. You might know him. He's been around for a while. He's got a couple dozen Pluralsight courses out there. I think better part of 8 books that he's worked on, either as a primary or contributing author. And he's a filmmaker too, because he's clearly got too much time on his hands. So with that, Shawn, take it away.
Well, thanks so much. The only reason I can do all this stuff is I don't have children. I'm convinced that that is the magic of deciding you want to be infertile, is that I've been able to get a lot done. Now let me figure out how to share. There it is. Every app moves it. Let's do that. The whole screen. So I'm not going to have the chat up. So if you have questions, raise your hand, but I'll try to get to them at the end. We're just going to talk
as well.
Great. And so feel free to interrupt if you need, or if there's something really pertinent. I don't work with 2 screens, so I can't do that little presenter trick. I'm on a couch, as you can see, with a laptop, and the microphone is the most immobile thing I have. Everything else is mobile, so we'll sort of go from there. And today I want to sort of introduce you to Vue 3 and TypeScript. This is going to be a bit more about Vue 3 than it is TypeScript, but I'll kind of talk about why I think TypeScript is important here. And some of the things I'm going to be talking about are applicable to Vue 2 as well, and I'll mention them. But if you're doing new development, Vue 3 is certainly probably the way you're going to want to do it. If anyone doesn't know who I am, I have a film out there called Hello World Film. I have a new film I'm working on called I'mFineFilm.com. I won't belabor too much what that's about. And Pluralsight author, book author, he pretty much covered everything I'm doing, so that's really awesome. And then I'm just going to dive into code. I'm not going to worry about too many screens explaining you why spas are good and all of that other things. You know, the reality is, for most of us, that we're developing client-side code in one of a handful of frameworks, you know, Angular or React or Vue, Svelte. You know, there's another handful of them out there, Ember. I'm sure I'm forgetting some really important ones that are important to somebody here, and I'll get a mention in the chat of why I didn't mention it. But they all have sort of the same goal. The reason why I've sort of gravitated towards Vue is that I like the simplicity of the way it works, even when you're actually doing a whole built spa from it. I gave a talk a couple years ago here where I talked about using Vue directly in the browser as sort of a replacement for jQuery or replacement for like AngularJS, where you could just sort of scale it up. And while that's true, what I'm going to be doing is actually building an app, not just adding it to an existing website. And I'm going to be doing this all in Visual Studio Code. All of this works in Visual Studio as well, especially if you're integrating with a .NET backend. But I'm going to sort of skip that so you can just see all the moving parts of Vue. So we don't have to get too deep into integrating it. I have talks about integrating Vue into ASP.NET. I have some videos. I have a new YouTube channel with some coding shorts that I think that's one of them now. Can't remember. It might just be a blog post. But enough talking. Let's look at some code. So one of the first things you're going to need is the Vue CLI. So Vue is a NPM tool that can be installed. And I'm currently using the 4.5 version. And this can just be installed at Vue/CLI. And usually I install it globally for my machine. I've already done this, so you can trust I already have it because I showed you Vue. And we're going to use a command called just Vue create, and we're going to give our little project a name, like bookcase. This is going to open up and give you some options for how you want to build this new app. You can use Vue 2 here. You can use Vue 2 or Vue 3 with Babel instead of TypeScript. You can see sort of the default there of using JavaScript in Vue 3. I'm going to manually select the feature so you can kind of see what this looks like. I'm going to choose which version of Vue I want. I'm going to include Babel and TypeScript in my particular case, because Babel adds some features to make development a little easier. So we're going to include both. I could turn on the viewer, the router, Vuex, linters, unit testing. I could, and often for a big project, I will turn on a lot of these. But let's start pretty simple. I'm going to use the 3.0. I don't know why it still says preview. It's been released for months and months now. And there is a class style component syntax that some people use. It sort of was Vue's answer to the way that Angular does components. I'm not a big fan of it, so I'm not going to use it, and it's the default. And here it says, should I use Babel with TypeScript? I'm going to choose the default. And then finally, do I want all my configuration in separate files or in the package.json? I'm going to choose the default as well, and I'm not going to save this. And at this point, it's going to initialize your project, and it's going to go ahead and, with npm, pull down all the required little bits. And if you go clockwise with your mouse, it will speed that whole process up. Usually when this is cached on a machine, it's pretty quick. But I will mention that there is an alternative to the Vue CLI as well called Vite, V-I-T-E. I'll have an article in Code Magazine about it probably this summer. If you want to see sort of a different way of doing this, Vite actually works with other frameworks as well. But we're going to go into Bookcase. And this is just a directory full of some configuration and then this magic source directory where all the Vue product is. So I'm going to open this up in code, and we'll spend the rest of our time in code. Make sure all this is big enough for you to see. So there's not a lot of moving pieces, but one of the things you'll see is here in Npm Scripts, there are scripts for serving, which is what you're going to do during development, or for a build, which is what you would do for production. So I'm just going to go ahead and run the serve. And this is going to essentially build it and then allow you to visit it in a browser. And every time I make a change, it'll recompile and hot swap the component so that your development environment is pretty quick. And I'm going to copy this because I actually use Firefox for my development browser. And if I just click it, it'll open up in Chrome. And so this is the out-of-the-box Hello World sort of Vue project it creates. And I'm going to tear it apart. Essentially, you're going to spend most of your time in source. And the way this works is that Vue starts with just a main, and in our case, this is going to be a main.ts file because we chose TypeScript. And it has this just little piece that says, when this is loaded on a page, find an element called app and put my application, this, what they call a view, in that component. And we can find this in index.html. This is just a generated HTML that it uses for development time. When you're integrating with a backend, this would ordinarily be on some like CS HTML page or on some other view page, depending on your backend. For .NET, obviously, probably a Razor page of some sort. And so here's that ID, and we're just going to replace our app with this. We're going to replace this div with our app. So the built files are sort of auto-injected here. You don't really need to look at this again, but I want you to just make sure you see what's actually happening. So there's not a whole lot interesting here in that main.ts. The most interesting is that the app is a component. Everything in Vue is a component. And we're using a .vue file. Now, what is that? I thought you said JavaScript. I thought you said TypeScript. A Vue file is what they call a single page component, or single file component, SFC. And if we look at this, essentially what it allows you to do is have the HTML in a template section, the script, notice the language is TS for us because we're using TypeScript, in a script section, and then styling, page-specific styling, in a style section. And all three of these pieces are actually optional, but for the most part, you'll have a template and script in each one of these. Let's clean this up a little so we can build this up. They're using a component called Hello World. I'm actually going to just remove that for a moment and remove it from our template so we can see how this all sort of works. And in components, I'm going to delete it as well. And so at this point, let's just make our template Hello World, right? So essentially we're saying when this gets mounted, just take whatever the template is here and whatever code I'm defining here and make them work together. Now we're literally not doing anything yet. When I press save, you'll notice that this window changes down here because it rebuilds it. And I'm going to go ahead and just minimize it so we can see everything real well. And so we have our first fully authored by us single page application, right? We have a application running in the browser, and if I inspect this, you'll actually see that that app.data is there, and then it puts a little tag in here so Vue knows how to monitor it, and then that's just our content. So none of this is really magical. It's just HTML that happens to have code that works against it or works with it. So let's, in our app, let's go ahead and create our first component. And I'm going to go ahead and just create a new file. And I'm going to put it in that components directory, though where you put it is really up to you. Doesn't have this sort of strict structure syntax you'll see a lot from Angular apps and React apps, especially, though there are some best practices on how to do this. And I'm just going to call this my bookcase. .view instead of .ts. Now, we can have .ts, and we'll actually see an example of this a little later. But we're going to make a single file component, and so I'm going to start with just a template. And then because I have some add-ins for it, it actually has some templates for us. So if we say script here, I can actually say, you know what, I want a composition TS for Vue. And this will actually do the sort of minimal work here, which is bring in define component, which is how we define an individual component, and then just structure the class the way it needs to be. And so in here, let's go ahead and just say H3 our books, right? Our bookshelf. And put our bookshelf on this, we actually will bring in our bookshelf. What did I call it? Bookcase. As a component. And then I can just use it here as bookcase. Or, as you can see it suggesting bookcase lower case as well. Either are fine. It's gonna view naturally either gives you a kebab case or natural case to your components. And so we'll just need to import this in. Components, bookcase, .view. Now, the view isn't actually necessary, but the TypeScript linter doesn't like it because it doesn't know how to find it. There are a couple ways to fix that, but I just use your for view classes. I just bring them in. And so this defines a component, and at compile time, it actually combines the template into the code file so that you're really dealing with a code file. Now we have our bookshelf, again, the world's most complicated spa so far. And we haven't done a whole lot to make anything work right. So let's, in our bookcase, let's do most of the work in the bookcase. I usually try to keep the app view pretty simple because I'm ordinarily probably introducing something like routing or Vuex into it, and keeping this simple to allow me to have sort of one place to do this. So I'm going to spend most of our time here in that bookcase. And what I want to be able to do here is say something like, I want to create a div for my book, right? I want to be able to put some data there. And if you've used Vue 2, this is probably going to be the biggest change, is this setup. Because the new component uses something called Composition API that you can opt into. But I quite like the Composition API, so I'm going to be showing you most of that. The idea behind the Composition API is simply that you're going to return what is bindable to your template. So here, if I create, let's create a thing called the books that is an array. I could then return that in books in the object here, and then use one of the pieces of Vue, like for book in books, in order to repeat this for each book and just say book dot, let's say title, right? And so what we're doing here is we're creating a collection of items that we can iterate through here. In the same way we could say const title, page title, let's say, our bookshelf, right? Little reason to do this, but just as a example, then we could go ahead and use it as a top level page title, right? So these double curly braces and these V dash attributes are all used to sort of empower the markup for the pages. Now we're getting a complaint about books, and that's because TypeScript wants type information. And right now it's trying to cast it into something called an any, and for the most part it doesn't know what an any is going to be. But that's not a big problem. Let's go ahead and come in here and say, let's say our ID is 1 and our title is going to be Brave New World, right? You'll notice it went away because now books is typed by TypeScript using what it inferred. It used this and says, oh, this is going to be an array of objects that look like this, ID and title. And in fact, if down here we were to write some code like books, we're going to get IntelliSense, and if we do something like key, it's going to complain because it doesn't, the type it inferred didn't have any of that information on it. Let's see if this worked. Where did, oh, there it went. And it hates everything. What do you mean attribute names can't contain any of that stuff? Oh, yeah. For V4s, it needs to be able to figure out which are which, so we can actually just say book.id. And this key is essentially saying, I forgot to put a quote there. It's essentially saying that it knows how to control each of these, because one of the important points is we're not binding one time, we're binding one way. So as the book collection changes, it's going to change this for us. How is that a invalid expression? It's not. So there's our Brave New World. I'm not sure why it's the compiler is complaining about this, but it's perfectly valid. That's life in Visual Code sometimes. So we have our one Brave New World, and this works. And if we were to add more, even at runtime, this could work. But let's not do that. Let's do a couple of things. Let's say that our books here, let's say we wanted to define what our book looked like. And we can actually use a type in TypeScript. And this is a different concept than you would see in C#, for example, because this is really saying that this is just a runtime dynamic type. This isn't an interface. This isn't a class. This is actually just the structure that I want to look for. So I'm going to say our work. I'm going to say that our type is going to be called work, and this is going to be ID is a number, and title is a string. So here we're saying that we have a type that knows about the structure, and then our array here can be new array of work, right? And so this book now knows about that type and is going to work in a more natural way instead of having these sort of inferred. And what you might see in a lot of TypeScript is this necessity to type it as array of work. But most of what TypeScript does for you is this inference, right? It knows that this is supposed to be an array of that work. And so that it's going to infer that for you as essentially an array of that work object. And we could also shorten this whole thing to work array as well. Oh, that's a type. That's right. That would work. Because remember in TypeScript, the colon is the type information and the equal is the actual assignment. So getting those right is important. Though in most cases, the inference is going to do most of our work for us. Just like page title thinks it's a string and that books is going to think it's a collection of books. We have that working. Let's take this a bit further, right? Let's make this actually do something. So let's add to our type here, has read as a Boolean. And let's come down here and just say books.push and push our original book, which is going to be ID. And this is where it can be confusing because I'm not generating a new work item. I'm generating an object that has to fulfill this. So you can think of this as somewhat like an interface. So I need a title, Brave New World, just like I had before. Then has read false, right? And once I do that, except for this weird squiggly, I'm going to make this all work. And now, one of the things you might be thinking is, why have just arbitrary code here? And one of the reasons is this, is that we're going to allow ourselves to use the closure of setup to be able to share data between them. And we'll see an example of that in a couple of minutes when we change this to a network request. And so if we come back here, we can see I have the books. I'm pushing an object into it, but we're not getting, we're getting the Brave New World, and that's great. Let's go ahead and add another piece here. div around that. And let's go ahead and put a button. Mark as read. So I've got a button here. I want to have it interactive. And one of the things you'll see is that just like this wasn't obvious, I didn't explain this a minute ago, but this colon here is actually an alias for something called von. It's like v4 has a reason to go this. von is saying, I'm sorry, not von, vbind is saying, please bind this attribute to this div. And the shortcut for vbind is actually just the colon. So that's why we could use a binding expression here inside of the key. Just like that, we're going to do the same thing here, is that we could use this to say, you know, the color is book dot has red, and actually put an expression in here like red and gray. Of course, color isn't really unbuttoned, but you can see essentially what I'm trying to say is that you can then change these quotes so it makes sense. Is then it's expecting that whatever is inside of this color is a binding syntax, is a binding expression. The other half of the bind is the von, and von will allow us to do handlers. In this case, what happens when someone clicks that button. And what we're going to do is we're going to define a method, and we could just have the method name as mark as read, or in our case, we're going to say mark as read and pass into that method or that function the book that they're actually clicking on. So we don't have to get the book ID. We don't have to go look it up in a list. We can just actually pass the instance of that book on the click. And the shortcut for von is at. So at click, mark as book, book. And of course, this shouldn't work because mark as book as read isn't actually on our interface. How do we do that? Well, just like we saw a minute ago, we can say function mark as read, book as work. So in this case, I'm going to case it, specify the type that it needs to be, so I can then more easily say book.hasRead equals true, right? And then we can use bind disabled equals book.hasRead. So if they've read it, we're just going to make the button disabled so they can't re-click it again. So if we've done that right, you should see that mark as read is changing. Of course, it's not super clear it's working, and there's a reason for that. The reason for that is the array of books and the books inside of them aren't reactive yet. So in order to bind to these objects, we actually have to wrap them in a wrapper that says, you know what, we're not binding to this once, we're going to watch for changes. And so what we do here is we add a method called ref, and this ref comes from view. So here you can see add ref to existing view. You'll see it being added there. And all this does with ref is wrap it in a value. So here, because books is now a ref, I have to say books.value.push. And the reason this is important is every time you set this value, it notifies the page to change itself. Of course, we're not showing that that is actually changing. Let me prove this to you by, let's create another div, and I'll show you a little section actually. Let's make it a pre, and I'll say book here. Now, why am I doing that? Doing that so we can actually see the structure of the underlying class. And hasRed is not being changed. Oh, yeah. It's not being changed. We'll actually see a bunch of errors in here. And it's not being changed because I never added mark as red to be set here, right? I haven't made this as part of the bindable surface for our button to work. So let's now look at it. We can see hasRed is turned true and this is turned disabled. Let's refresh it again, because again, we're obviously not saving this anywhere. We can see that interaction all happening. So let's get rid of the pre-book because that's going to make our whole page unclear. Let's see what time we have. Oh, we got plenty of time. Good. So now let's get rid of pushing our book and let's actually go read these from somewhere. And we'll start to see where the type safety of this becomes even more important. And so what I'd like to do is make a is bring in a library called Axios. So I'm going to add this to our project. And I could use fetch directly in the browser, and a lot of people do like to use that. I actually prefer Axios because it knows about TypeScript and can be type safe. And so let's see what that looks like. If I let's go ahead and create a new, let's call it services.ts. And I'll call this our API.ts. And here I'm just going to export a default object that has some properties. This way we can import it and then we can call and let's say get all books, right? And this is going to return some books. Nope, not a bookcase. And how are we going to actually return this? We're going to return this by calling an API. We're going to say const result equals axios.get. And then the axios.get, I'm going to cheat. I have it over in a Word document because I can remember. Ignore the flashing lights. There's nothing to see here. So I have a Open Library has an API for getting information. I'm going to bring in Axios as a library, and I could do this by just saying return this and then handling the promise at the other end, because this is going to be an asynchronous operation, right? You'll notice that it returns a promise that includes the response. So instead of this, let's go ahead and make this asynchronous and use await here. And await, I'm going to do what I was doing before, which is result equals await if result dot status equals 200, then it was successful. Then we can just say return result dot data. Result dot data is going to be the entire object that is returned. So over here in bookcase, I'm going to introduce a new piece, which is called onMounted. Now, Vue handles the situation of wanting to respond to certain events in their cycle. And when a component's been mounted, we're able to do some things. So onMounted, once the component has been loaded, I'm just going to have a lambda here, or an arrow function if you're thinking of TypeScript or JavaScript, that runs some code. And what's that code going to do? It's going to call our services dot, actually, what did I call it? API dot get all books. And you'll notice when I did that, it went ahead and inferred that the API was from our services. And that because of this, because this is asynchronous, this event handler needs to be asynchronous as well. And so I'm going to get our result by calling await, just like we did before. And then I can say books.push result works. I happen to know that the result is a container for the actual list of works that are found. And this is going to complain. Oh, yeah, books.value. See, it was actually helping me. Books.value.push. So I'm saying that, hey, the books are going to be changed by adding these works in here. And one of the kind of cool tricks, especially if you used Vue 2, is Vue 2 relied on a lot of magic tricks with the this pointer, where it was putting things on that this pointer that you might need. Here, because we're returning what is supposed to be in the page, any of these asynchronous or events that are handled all just work because what? We're all dealing with a single scope. We're using the closure of the setup to allow us to share data between this without having these magical sort of global variables everywhere. If I did this right, we now see a bunch of books from that natural library, and they should all continue to work with the mark as red because we're not what's the word I'm looking for? We're not specifying that. Oh, that was from earlier. Let's get rid of this. And so we're seeing that this can just work in sort of the natural way we want it to work. But all of this is very untyped, right? We're getting information here. We want it. And Axios actually allows us to say get and then some type, like I'll call it a work, right? Now remember, I had specified in here that we had a type called work. Let's comment that out for a minute, because what we really want to do is figure out what this API does. So I'm going to grab this API for a minute. Let's open it up in a different browser. So here's the actual result. You can see that works is the collection of the books and its page, so I could go and get additional works if I wanted to. I'm not going to get into any of that deep things, but one of the things I'll usually do is I'll take the entire result here and I'll use JSON to ts.com to convert this into TypeScript. So I've taken just this result, it has generated as it inferred what TypeScript interfaces would look like. So let's come back over here. I'm going to create a models subdirectory, and I'll call it works.ts. And I'm just going to paste that all in. I'm going to get rid of the namespaces because for something this simple, I'm not going to worry about namespacing everything. And effectively, what we get is the things that couldn't figure it out. Like, here's the interface for the actual work, and the work has a couple of other pieces in it, like a collection of authors and this object that has availability. So it's inferred those as interfaces as well. The only one that it doesn't know about the name is that root object doesn't really have a name. So I'm going to call it our book result, just so we have a nice clean name there. So let's close that. And so now that we have a work interface, let's bring it in from model. And then when we return this, that's going to return the actual, that shouldn't be work. Oh yeah, this should be book result. We're going to add that in here. We actually don't need work in our particular case. And we can change this to say, you know what, we're going to return a promise of what? Work array. No, it doesn't like that because what we're actually doing is returning the works. Oh, yeah. fails, we're not going to do anything. We want to return null. Well, how does that work? If you're in C#, this would be natural. Like, no, this is a nullable thing. What we actually can do is say this is going to be a promise that returns either work result or null. What? Is that okay? Oh, let's bring that work back in here. Is that okay? It is. So types in TypeScript are a lot more expressive than you might be used to in C#. Being able to have this return either a null, this is going to explain better what it does. And in fact, if we don't type that return, what happens when we look at all books? It is inferred that as the return type because it's looked at our code and go, oh, it's either returning an array of books or a null. We don't need to actually specify that. And because we did that, a couple of things happen. First, let's bring in that work from models. So we have it. And then this is saying, hey, result.works doesn't exist because we know that what result is now is actually that collection of books or null. So because we returned a different object, we can now actually just return that. If result, notice that it complained until we actually checked for the result before sending it, because this could be null and it knows about that null. By checking it, it knows that this is fine to just be work because I've already checked it against being null or not null. And now, because this is a work, it doesn't know what to do. There is no has read. So let's put checked out. Let's use checked out instead. This is a property that already exists on it, and we'll just be able to use it there instead. And let's use it here again, checked out. And notice that it's still doing type checking because now we've told it what books is. You're going to get that same sort of correction or at least suggestion to fix it here. So the key isn't book ID, it's actually key, because in our new object that we're getting from the APIs, it doesn't have an ID. A work has a key instead that's actually a string. So if we go back here, we can now see all these lovely things and that they still work because we're actually setting them on a different object. But during compilation time, we're getting a better experience because we're finding these errors way before we thought they were going to happen. It allows us to bring the errors earlier and earlier. This isn't going to affect your doing type safety at runtime, only at compile time, which is different from .NET certainly. But it does reduce the amount of errors that you are going to necessarily expose to the user. Last thing I want to talk about as it relates to this composition model versus the sort of having properties from view 2 is it's important because a lot of this means that we can compose pieces of our views in even smaller and smaller pieces. So you can imagine that if I had, let's create another service, and it's not going to do anything because I don't have time to really. And let's call it our error service. And we'll export a default. In this case, we'll export a default function. Set error. And let's say window dot my error equals error message, right? Again, this isn't doing anything interesting. Of course, it's type safety, so it's not going to like it. Always get that wrong. Let's just do that. It shouldn't mind it. Let's go ahead and make this a string. Again, the creation of this doesn't really matter. Let's just do const message. This is where you get to the part where I didn't script it out, so we're sort of doing stuff on hand. And assume we're going to do something with the error message. I have some good examples of how to do this. So instead of every page needing a way to set those error messages, we could just then say else error failed to load books. Right, and you'll notice that when I set error, it grabbed it from the error service. So I can simply compose this as individual pieces of our entire piece. I don't have to think about how set error happens. It can have its own dependencies or its other ways of doing it. Maybe it just writes it to the console right now, and then later, oh, I guess I put it in the wrong directory. Later, I can change this console log or console error to something that actually shows it on the screen. And so it allows me to better compose this. Of course, we can't get it to fail for us because it's not failing, but you can imagine having ways to sort of think about that, to sort of compose these different pieces, which was really difficult with the old option syntax from Vue 2, and that still works in Vue 3, but I don't necessarily care about it. So with that, let's go to the questions and see if anyone has anything they want to ask, wanted me to slow down or speed up. I will give you access to this demo on my website in the next day or two when I post it. So there were a couple questions here. Slalom. Is template global or is it confined to our component? So in our case, I'm still sharing my screen, correct? Yeah. In our case, this template is local, just like the script tag would be, to this component. And so this gets injected because in the app.view, I've told it where to put it. And so everything that happens in here is local to the component, and then we're telling it here to just inject it here in the template of the parent component that's using it, and then ultimately our main.ts is saying, you know what, find that piece of the HTML on the page and inject our app there. And so it becomes this hierarchy of components. I hope that answered your question, Spider Monkey. Anyone else have questions? Feel free to just use your mics if you prefer. I could not have been that clear.
It made it all seem easy.
That can't be true.
I have a question, Shawn. Your website is at the shawnw.me/psauthor?
It can be. That one actually takes you to Pluralsight. It's just Wildermuth, like my last name, .com. So wildermuth.com.
Thank you.
And I publish new things at least weekly there. Sometimes it's the video, sometimes it's announcements, sometimes it's how-tos. So feel free to visit there. No other questions, really? Did you just come for the giveaways? Please raise your hand if you just came for the giveaways. Liars. I was like, how do I raise my hand?
I was told there would be a pizza delivered to my house.
There would. It's pretty easy to,
You don't have pizza? I thought you had pizza.
I did have pizza, actually. Shawn, what would be the resources, the best resource that you would recommend for somebody just getting started from ground zero with Vue?
Well, the most obvious one, let me go back to my slides real quick, is Vue. you got Vue.js.org. That's the easiest one that will get you started in most cases. I have there are some Pluralsight courses on them as well. I have one on forms in Vue.js that I quite like, but it's a matter of once you get comfortable with. Let me go back to this part. Once you get comfortable with this part of the command line of just actually generating that first file and trusting that this serve continually building and updating your project, once you get comfortable with it, the code's actually pretty easy. I did want to have a small plug, though. If anyone wants to start using Vue and wants a reason to do it, the Richard Campbell's Humanitarian Toolbox is looking for some Vue developers to finish a project to help people create emergency plans for themselves and their families. I'm doing one of the sections, but there's about 6 or 7 sections that need to be done. So if someone wants to volunteer there, I can get you an invite and introduce to the right people to actually work on something that will actually help people. If assuming you have some free time. Other questions?
Hey, Shawn, I'll throw this one out there. What would you say is the major difference between Vue 2 and Vue 3?
That's a good question. The big difference between 2 and 3 really is the composition API, though it's been backported to 2, so you can use that in both, and a much better support for TypeScript. TypeScript was the big thing that Vue 2 just did not do well. Because the opinion syntax couldn't really use the TypeScript information, everything ended up being as a bunch of any's if you use TypeScript. It's also faster, but I find that it's just more mature. There are a couple of libraries that haven't yet made their port to 3, and so there are some projects that are still stuck in 2. In fact, the Humanitarian Toolbox is one of those because they use a project called Vuetify to in order to do material design with it, and they're still waiting on 3. But at the core of it, it simplified a bunch of things that I thought were more confusing. I find 3 a little simpler. I do have a couple of articles at Code Magazine that sort of walks you through the difference between 2 and 3. That is also a good resource instead of me sort of iterating each one of them. But for the most part, I find it less magical, more clear. For instance, so one of the things that honestly some people don't like about the option syntax is this idea that we have to wrap these elements in order to make them reactive. And what essentially happens is you have 2 versions of this. You have a ref and you have a reactive wrapper. And the difference here is, for the most part, refs are natural for primitive types, arrays, strings, numbers, etc. And reactive is really just a proxy. So it's a deep proxy. So if you wrap this in let me do it this way. I did a const current book. Let's say we had one that was selected and we had reactive for a books.value, the first one, right? It will know that anytime you just set properties on this book to make it reactive, so you don't have to deal with the value piece. And some people don't like that it's not as magical about the way it does reactivity as 2 was. I actually prefer it because then it becomes clear what's happening. There's less magic because I'll know whether it's a reactive object or not. But there is some split on opinion there. And some people are also still using a syntax called the class syntax, but that has sort of died on the vine because it has a lot of the same problems opinion did in that there's so much sort of magic that's happening that when you run into a bug, it's sometimes you're fighting the framework instead of it just being something that's inside of your code base. Other questions? One thing that now that I'm reading SpiderMonkey's question, I did want to mention this. So in my main app view, I'm using Bookcase, and this isn't imported globally, but you can, instead of main.js, actually the object you get from create app, you can also do component and Bookcase, so you don't have to include it in each one. I don't find the need of global components to be that common, that I usually use this aspect where a component I'm importing is imported only into my library and etc. So it's more of a dependency chain than it is 1,000 global objects that we can just use magically everywhere. Any other questions? Feel free to reach me at Shawn@wildermuth.com if you have any questions afterwards. And since there's no more questions, I appreciate it. I'll be hanging out until the end in either case, so let me know.
Thanks, Shawn. Fantastic presentation. Learned a lot as usual.